We have troops all over the world, and yet we don't call that a forever war because there's a few hundred troops here and there. That's part of national security as people are plotting to destroy free markets and destroy Western civilization. So this is part of the status quo, if you will, and yet somehow we thought that the smartest thing in Afghanistan would be to go from occupying the country, which was basically a colonial control for 20 years, to completely leaving a vacuum that basically allowed the only folks with weapons to do a bloodless coup, which is what happened.
Welcome to Old Guy Talks to Me, a podcast dedicated to helping guys create kick-ass lives for themselves and those that they love. Ladies, if you want to know what your guy is thinking, this podcast is for women too. Each week, a special guest helps you create that life you've imagined. We talk anti-aging medicine, personal growth, relationships and hot sex. Yeah, you hear me, getting laid more frequently, other guy vices, and topics that many don't want to talk about but need to. Just because you're getting older doesn't mean you have to be old. Don't want to miss anything? Be sure to subscribe, share, rate, and review this podcast. And be sure to go to www.thestandard.academy/magazine and grab a free copy of our new digital magazine, The Standard Academy, where we talk about erogenous zones, growing hair back, and other things that will help you create that kick-ass life. Now get ready to listen up and share with friends.
This is Oris, the official old guy at oldguytalkstome.com, a podcast dedicated to helping older guys create kick-ass lives for themselves and those that they love. And sometimes part of that kick-ass life is talk about politics and current events. And I have as my guest today, Middle East expert, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser is the son of Syrian immigrants who fled Ba'athist oppression in 1966. He is a physician and former Navy lieutenant commander and president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, a Phoenix-based counter-Islamism think tank founded in 2003. He's also a co-founder of a Muslim Reform Movement and a former vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, appointed by the U.S. Senate from 2012 to 2016. He is an internationally recognized expert on Islamism, political Islam. He's widely published in the field, featured in many top-tier media, regularly testifies to the U.S. Congress on Islamist global threat and our domestic foreign policy. He's also the author of a book called A Battle for the Soul of Islam, and American Muslim Patriots Fight to Save His Faith. He hosts a weekly podcast on Reform This on the Blaze Radio Network. You can also find him sometimes on Fox and other news shows talking about stuff in the Middle East. So, and he also happens to be my primary care physician, but he can't say that. I can say that. He can't because of HIPAA. HIPAA laws. I'm tired of signing for my HIPAA consent forms for my glasses at Costco. How silly is that? So we want to talk about Afghanistan because, since this summer, a lot of bad stuff has happened, and just kind of from your perspective as an expert in this area, tell us what you think. What do you think about this whole thing in Afghanistan, the withdrawal, and then we'll get into the future, the repercussions.
So, Oris, it's great to be back with you. And, I think as you look at things like this, you got to start with the big picture and then get to the details. Obviously, the Biden administration screwed up the details big time. Big picture is, one of the lessons of being there for 20 years is that we learned that they have centuries-old problems, tribal problems, tribalisms, ideological issues that we're trying to fix. And I can tell you as an American Muslim, as much as I've always thought that the bigger problem was a military issue to target radical Islamists, to target terrorists, etc., that's simply a symptom. The surface of it, the deeper issue is theocracy, political Islam. Groups like the Taliban don't come out of thin air. And we're not going to defeat that by having troops everywhere. And ultimately, we learned the lesson that after 20 years, we need to get out of there and simply have surgical operations to target groups that really want to threaten us militarily, but then let the Afghanis figure their problems out, the Syrians figure their own problems out, the Egyptians, Iraqis, etc., but simply maintain a secure America by having good intel on the ground, working with our allies. Now, having said that, the way we withdraw was everything. The way you leave a place determines whether you globally and domestically there own it, or whether you hand it over in a way that clearly the people of Afghanistan own it. There was no military thought to the removal of anything. It was done intentionally backwards and intentionally to fail. I mean, it was almost, if you could do a medical example, the two most important days when you get admitted to a hospital are the first day on admission and the discharge day, because you get a whole plan set up so patients don't come back to the hospital. Well, we completely screwed up the discharge plan as we were leaving, and we actually did it backwards so that the military left first and left all these citizens evacuating through the busiest, most dangerous place, which was Kabul, and we didn't have them go through Bagram or any of the other bases that were ours. Well, by the way, we left billions of dollars of weapons and military materials behind. I mean, it was just completely done backwards, and obviously because it was run by state instead of the Pentagon, and it could have been done so differently. We could have had our allies, like in the Panjshir resistance, which are still fighting the Taliban. We could have basically declared that there was a coup happening as we pulled out, but no, we didn't call it a coup. We said, now the Taliban is taking over Afghanistan, when in fact, most of the people of Afghanistan will tell you they don't want the Taliban running the place. And they had no strategy for this. So unfortunately, what it did was create a huge amount of resentment in that we left this way. The police, the troops, Biden administration tried to throw them under the bus to say the Afghani soldiers were the weak ones, and they just sort of abandoned their posts. Well, but the secret was the fact that we were providing air support, we were providing intelligence, and we completely pulled the plug on their intelligence to know where the Taliban was. And they're like, well, we no longer have information. We're not going to stand here like sitting ducks. So therefore, they didn't teach them in 20 years. We didn't teach them and give them the equipment in order to protect themselves. And the Panjshir resistance in northeastern Afghanistan was still the only place that was a stronghold. And we didn't even empower them to have a handoff. But no, we then turned around and said the Taliban were the legitimate government of Afghanistan, which is completely absurd.
Yeah. Well, I know Joe and his folks are hoping for an inclusive Taliban. I can't believe how they get that politically correct language into everything. I mean inclusivity, women's rights. I mean, who do they think they're dealing with? So it was interesting because I was watching the testimony of General Miley, the Secretary of Defense, and they were actually saying that irrespective of what Biden said, they had actually recommended a status of forces of about 2,600 to stay in Afghanistan, and so I mean that was their recommendations. I think there was one other general, I can't remember who it was, who actually had recommended that. So he kind of because Uncle Joe is he's a military savant, and we can just look at his record.
He's gotten every 50 years, every foreign policy decision possible he's gotten wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of an interesting thing. One of the things that there's a couple of things I want to talk with you about. We go into these countries every once in a while, and militarily. How hard is it go? And you want to recruit locals to support you. Having seen this debacle, how hard do you think it's going to be to recruit locals if ever we have to go into another military campaign?
That's a great question, Horace, because this is the issue: is that we fought the Cold War against the Soviets, and we never ended up firing a bullet against the Russians or Soviets at the time, and we had maybe some proxy wars. But we realized that with hundreds of scholars on Russian warfare, Soviet warfare, what were they doing against us in the information war? We created Radio Free Europe. We created civil society organizations that ultimately, when the curtain came down, you had countries like Estonia and others that all of a sudden became free markets that had a seeds of reform, if you will, that were part of the liberty movement that we realized was the way to counter Soviet communism. So similarly, we're not doing any of that right now because of a number of factors that include political correctness, that include a fear of addressing religious issues, even though as an American, there's nothing more American than fighting theocracy. That's what our founding fathers did. So I'm not sure I understand why you can't engage Muslims who want to fight theocracy. In Iran, you've got the Green Revolution that is fighting against the mullahs. And same thing in Afghanistan. You've got today, like you said, you've got women's groups, soccer teams, symphonies, musicians, others that now went from loving America to that we're protecting them to now hating us because they said, you guys just led us to a cliff and threw us off as you left. And this is the problem is, okay, you have the Biden administration now to the Senate testifying, well, there was no other way. This was always going to happen. Well, if that's always going to happen, then you let them know that that's going to happen. You give them 6 months. You leave a few hundred, maybe a few thousand troops like we have in Djibouti. We have troops in Somalia. We have troops all over the world. And yet we don't call that a forever war because there's a few hundred troops here and there. That's part of national security as people are plotting to destroy free markets and destroy Western civilization. So this is part of the status quo, if you will. And yet somehow we thought that the smartest thing in Afghanistan would be to go from occupying the country, which was basically a colonial control for 20 years, to completely leaving a vacuum that basically allowed the only folks with weapons to do a bloodless coup, which is what happened. And everywhere now in the Muslim world, what's going to happen is they're going to say, this is what happened when America comes in. They have a 2-year attention span because of elections, 4 years at best because of the presidential elections, and you just wait them out, and you're going to basically then be able to defeat them. So we were handed a defeat. Biden gave the Islamists a surrender. And This is the way the narrative is going to be had. And they're not going to look to us to help them. They're going to look to the Russians. They're going to look to Chinese. They're going to look to other countries to work with them. And that's extremely, I can't tell you how heartbreaking that is when you think about the ideology that follows those other countries versus America.
Sure.
Do you need accountability? Are you looking to change the course of your life but have failed to keep on track? Too often we take in information and fail to act. Do you need an accountability program to stay the course? Then go to www.thestandard.academy and find out about my accountability program that goes with my course that helps you find out what you want, why you want it, and how to get it. The accountability program keeps you on track to get results.
Now, because you follow this a lot more pretty closely, do you have what are your sources telling you as to how many Americans are still left behind, and how many special visa holders are still left behind in Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's some. It's amazing to me that with all of the American resources that we have, the groups doing a lot of the work are veterans groups, nonprofits that are Gold Star family organizations, Clarion Project that's been working with us on counter-jihad work, has helped a number of folks through connections get out of Afghanistan. So the State Department themselves are saying there's 100 to 200 people left. I think the more realistic number is somewhere under 1,000, somewhere between 500 to 1,000. Now, I think the other heartbreaking thing, Orest, is that they're saying that they're blaming those citizens. They're saying, oh, they chose to stay there. I can tell you, I spoke to one family. The individual that's there said, you know what? I wasn't going to leave in the cluster that was happening in Kabul because look what happened to the 13 soldiers that got killed in that terror attack. Mm-hmm. He said he had to wait a few weeks because it was so dangerous and so poorly organized. Once the dust settled, then he wanted to get out of there and still wants to get out of there. So to say that just because they didn't be part of the chaos that was happening in Kabul, that somehow that meant that they wanted to stay there is absurd. Number two, many of them stayed because they don't want their families to die when they leave. So they have to figure out a safe process to either get them to the Panjshir region or to figure out what is the safety for their family, because they're going to be targeted, as we see now, the Taliban targeting families, brothers, sisters, children are being killed that we used to work with the Americans.
Yeah, well, not, as you mentioned that people wanted safety, but a lot of time, for the last few days of this evacuation of this horrible thing that they call the evacuation, you couldn't get to the airport even if you wanted to. I mean, it was just the roads were being blocked by Taliban and things like that. So it's just totally absurd to say that these people elected to stay there.
Orest, the State Department's map to the airport showed checkpoints that were run by the Taliban.
Yeah.
I mean, that by itself, that map should be held in history as an example of American incompetence for eternity.
Yeah. No, I totally agree, because it's just you couldn't have planned it worse. You couldn't, if you were to sabotage it, you couldn't have done it worse. So what are the terrorist groups that exist now in Afghanistan? And so I gather there's some of them they're fighting amongst themselves and things like that. And so what's all that about?
So let's define terrorism. So terrorist groups are those that believe that the ends justifies the means, that they can use violence against non-combatants, that they can have asynchronous warfare. The number one terror group is the government, Taliban. The Taliban is the number one terror group, and it's amazing to me that we have not declared them a terror group to this point, even though when we had terrorists getting out of Gitmo and through Qatar and elsewhere, they were ex-Taliban, and now, by the way, after we pulled out a couple of weeks ago, there was a skirmish that happened inside the presidential palace where you had the Haqqanis and their network, which is actually a more militant network than even the Taliban, if it's even possible to fathom that. But these are more sort of rugged, centuries-old tribe that has straddled Pakistan and Afghanistan. And let me remind you, the borders with Afghanistan are what? To the north is Iran, and to the east is Pakistan. So you have probably this is another thing, is we basically, by evacuating, completely lost a foothold in an unbelievably necessary intel place when it comes to monitoring terror groups. Because north in Iran, you've got terror groups of Hezbollah, of Iranian, the IRGC, the Iranian Republican Guard, is one of the largest terror groups in the region, which is the military of Iran. But thankfully, the Trump administration declared them a terror group. Now, I think the Biden administration is already making noise to declassify them as no longer classify them as a terror group, which would be insane. But anyways, to the east with Pakistan, you've got Haqqani Network, you've got Jamaat Islamiyah, which is a political group, but it shoots out organizations that are terror groups. Within Afghanistan, we saw the attack that killed 13 of our soldiers was done by, they think, ISIS-K, which is ISIS Khorasan. Khorasan is the old Persian term for caliphate, and that area of the caliphate, which was endemic to Afghanistan. So that group was basically nothing other than probably a few hundred to 1,000 or so jihadis. They came out of, dormancy. Why? This shows the insanity of what Biden did. By evacuating so quickly, the brand of jihad was exploding. So once the brand starts exploding, you're going to have small groups coming out of nowhere in order to declare that they are the victors, that they have won. And what better way to declare victory than to kill some of our troops on the way out? And that's what ISIS-K tried to do. And obviously, I believe it's correct. The intel so far has been that they are the ones that committed that. And there are other small groups, but Al-Qaeda is still in Afghanistan, contrary to Biden's main talking point, which is, well, we defeated bin Laden and we defeated Al-Qaeda, so therefore they've been decimated and we need to go. They're still there. So that talking point, I agree, we need to get out of Afghanistan. Not every single troop, but maybe, like you said, up to 500 to 1,000 that would stay there. The process should have been done differently. But to think that Al-Qaeda is gone, there's Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, there's Al-Qaeda in the Afghani, Pakistani, Indo-Pakistani region also.
Yeah, so it's kind of it's a big mess and thing. What there's much talk, and then we found out how good it is this over the horizon capabilities, which I think we saw a result of that when that man and his family got taken out in Kabul. That was that was a failure of intelligence, and having giving up Bahram, which was so close to not only the Arab countries but also to China. It was just an incredible strategic mistake to do that. But what do you see as over the loss of having human assets to help you with intelligence?
I can tell you, as the son of Arab immigrants, and the Arab tribalism is no different than the Pashto tribalism, the Indian tribalism. A lot of the Eastern culture tribalism. Many of them stay off the grid electronically. So you cannot, absolutely, there's importance to our satellite imagery. There's importance to a lot of the, technological assets. As I mentioned, when you pulled it, they lost a lot of the eyes and ears on the Taliban. But one of the reasons we hadn't lost a human life in 18 months of American citizens or soldiers was because of the human assets that we had in Afghanistan. Now, we've not only lost them, many of them now have overnight gone from wanting to work with us to hating us. So we've antagonized them. But to think, if you talk to anybody that's been in the State Department, CIA, and Intel, whether it's in Pentagon or elsewhere, they will tell you that many times, heck, we got the weapons of mass destruction story wrong in Iraq because Powell and others were relying on he said, she said, and on technology movements that they saw with satellite imagery that turned out to be, I still think there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, not that I knew at the time, but because we saw chemicals used against our families in Syria that had to have been in Iraq, but that's a whole different story. My point is that the intel was horrible that Powell was using because we had nobody in Iraq. We had no, with Saddam's regime, our information ops in Iraq were horrible. So all we were relying on was imagery, this over the horizon. So we're going to continue to have killing of innocents, which is, again, what the Biden administration is now doing, a mea culpa. Oh my gosh, we didn't mean to kill these women and children. This is what happens when you don't have people on the ground and you take a shot. You think this is ISIS-K that they thought they were retaliating against, and it turns out now we have senior generals apologizing in Senate hearings because they killed families and not actual terrorists.
Yeah, I think that that policy of having a heavy reliance on satellites actually started under Bill Clinton many years ago, when he sort of pulled back and he said, "Oh, we got all these satellites and we can just watch from the sky, and human assets aren't that important." That was it was just total insanity. So
actually, just to add one thing, and yet if you look at Bill Clinton, the most successful aspect of his foreign policy was Bosnia, and Bosnia succeeded to liberate them from Milosevic and the Serbs and other things, because you had a UN protection force that America was leading. We had air protection and others. It was folks on the ground. We were working with organizations, and it wasn't over the horizon.
Yeah. There's that's like, usually when businesses start going bad, it's usually that the owner or the CEO spends too much time in his office, because he just got that over horizon management, which is actually happens. So, what do you see happening in the future with Afghanistan itself? Because, like I said, there's reports of fighting amongst various groups, things like that. What's the status of the resistance? Do they stand a chance? I mean, is anyone providing? I'm sure it's very highly classified. I mean, is anyone providing them any sort of armament or what? It's kind of a scary thing.
Yeah, so I'm going to tell you about Afghanistan, and then let's talk about what I think is going to happen to American foreign policy. But first, in Afghanistan, they are going to descend into a civil war. And the reason this is going to go on is first there's going to be internecine battles between the Islamists, that presidential palace, fight that happened between the Haqqanis and the Taliban happened because they were arguing about who could take credit. And it wasn't just the machismo of taking credit for America leaving. It had to do with the fact that they basically had a coup with there was no democratic, slate of officers. Now they're trying to say who can get the will of the people, and they want to be able to campaign or at least get some type of populist support from the Taliban community by basically saying that they were responsible for getting America to leave. So right now there's a lot of jockeying in the information war about who can be responsible for saying that they were the reason why finally Afghanistan was liberated from the colonialists. That's the radicals. So that internecine battle, they're probably going to try to dampen as they realize that 60 to 70% of the country doesn't agree with their Taliban-esque 13th century theocracy and wants to go back to the Afghanistan of the mid-20th century that was more liberated, pre-mujahideen, pre-jihadis, and had 20-30% of women that were had graduate degrees, that had a vibrant civilization, and that was all lost when the mujahideen took over, and then was hardened by their battle against the Soviets, and then obviously now with us there. So Afghanistan will have this sort of battle between the Panjshir corner and the resistance, and then versus the Taliban. There will be a lot of civil society skirmishes between which organizations. They said they were gonna. It was just, I think it was the craziest thing when you saw Secretary Blinken say we were going to demand that they give women equal rights and a position in their police and elsewhere. They've already verified, Orest, that no women will be going to Kabul University. No women will be allowed into graduate or university programs. So I don't think they're going to be in military or security leadership. So it will descend into civil war. Now, if you go based on Afghani history, if it repeats itself, it'll stay that way as a dysfunctional, failed state for some time. I think that if we begin to actually, one of the main lessons that I think is the only silver lining in all of this malpractice is that as America realizes there's no military solution, we're going to have to start to look at non-military solutions, which is how do we empower civil society and our allies on the ground that agree with us to begin working with them to create movements like we are in Iran. We're working, it's not just it's not just our government, but, if you look at the technology companies around the world, many of them are helping some of the movements covertly, and women's movements and others throughout Iran and elsewhere. And I think that's going to be the future. If you don't want a nuclear Iran, the best thing to defeat that is the revolution, the civil society movements of reformists that are a majority of Iran and are the same thing in Afghanistan. But I think you're going to see a lot of civil strife. Syria is the same way. It's a failed state now. Assad is still running it, and the only reason he's still alive and still running Syria is because of Russian and especially Iranian troop support there. So as long as he has those countries supporting him, he'll be there forever. But Afghanistan, I think what's going to happen is the Taliban will strangulate the rest of the community once they start getting support from China and Iran and Qatar. Those three countries and Turkey, by the way, is the fourth Islamist sort of corner of the square that's helping the Taliban consolidate power, which is amazing if you think about it, because Turkey's a NATO power and is supposed to be part of our circle of influence, and yet they're still to this day helping them run the airport in Kabul and helping a lot of the services that we simply backed away from overnight.
Yeah, my big concern, because you talk about the Biden administration's talking about leverage that they have over the Taliban, financial leverage, which I think is just totally a joke. But what I want your perspective is these Americans and these special visa holders, they're bargaining tools, they're bargaining chips against us.
I mean, yeah, I've read an article by a friend at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy that, I think it was Bill who wrote, we basically have another Iranian hostage crisis,
Yeah, but on
and
steroids.
yeah, and they're all over the place, and nobody's calling it that. And hopefully we'll get them out of there before they actually become hostages like they were under Carter. But there's no doubt that there's a lot of similarities to that, and terrorists love to create chaos. They don't care if they get bombed as a result. They will. They know that our country no longer has the appetite for redeployment into that region. So there's a lot of ways in which it's clear that the lives that are there are under significant risk. And you mentioned financial risk for the Taliban. Do you realize that 90% of the financial assets of the Afghani government and now the Taliban is in American banks? It's in our banks. So we could overnight shut off that government. Now, what happened is the UN has reached out in the last couple of weeks and said, well, we're going to give them $180 million. So all of a sudden now the US is talking about, separate from that banked money, they're talking about sending more money to protect them. And Erdogan at the UN General Assembly, the Islamist neo-caliph that is running Turkey right now, basically told the UN to say, you need to normalize relationships with the Taliban and realize that they are the government of Afghanistan now, and also provide them support so that the population don't suffer. If you think no different than Syria or anywhere else, when you hand dictators and theocrats money, all it does is go to promote their terrorism and their fascism and not have anything to do with helping the people. And yet, this is what's happening now, is that the Biden administration is talking about sending millions via the UN to supposedly trusted organizations on the ground, which now there's no more left because we left. So it's like when they tell me you're sending good money to Syria. I have family dying in Syria, and yet I don't know where anybody could send money because it's completely controlled by the government. Yeah. This is the issue, is that the situation there is horrific, and it's a problem we created by having no solutions that we left behind that could continue to operate. And the citizens left there, our citizens, our people, are basically hostages.
Yeah. No, it's the money is also kind of an interesting factor, simply because a lot of the raw materials for solar batteries that China makes, one of the places that it is in Afghanistan.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And they said that I read, I can't remember where it was, but about $1 trillion worth of the minerals. I can't remember specifically what mineral, but the one that's very hard to find for solar batteries.
Wow, so it's not just cocaine and heroin and
no. They're
for the Taliban.
The Taliban, yeah. I wish they'd use their own stuff. Maybe they do. That would be, maybe we should introduce meth over there. No, I didn't say that.
Just for the Islamists.
That's fine exactly. With me. Okay. So what do you see? And I know we need to wind up here. What do you see as far as future for American foreign policy as a result of this?
Yeah, so this is the issue, is clearly now we're going more towards a American-centric approach, at least on the conservative side. And also, I think the vast majority of Americans have had it with prolonged deployments. And I'm with you. I'm with them on that. I don't think significant deployments have proven to be of anywhere worth the investment. Now, having said that, I think what's going to happen is, at least in this administration for the next few years, we're going to beget more terrorism, we're going to beget more insecurity, and we're going to see, obviously, jihadists more at risk as our border's been more open. We have not only folks coming in the Mexican border from Haiti and not even countries that are necessarily proximal or close to Mexico, but from all over the world, Hezbollah, et cetera. So, there's going to be opportunity here as they see weakness in America for jihadi attacks. And you may wonder, well, why would they do that if we're withdrawing? Well, what it does is create their brand. So the jihadi brand over the next 5 to 10 years is going to try to reclaim its stake and viability. And in Europe, you and I talked about this last time, whether it's France, Belgium, Austria. Austria has declared war on political Islam, and trying to outlaw that idea. So you have Islamists that now are beginning to have battlegrounds where they can, in the West, start to say that they have a reason to believe not only are they militarily winning in Afghanistan, ideologically, they're taking on all Muslims in Austria and elsewhere. So I think what's going to happen is the smart folks in America, the rational ones, are going to start to look at what is the best policy and start to create institutions and the beginning, what we should have done, like what we did in the early 50s when we started to realize we needed an information war to create to start to win the Cold War. That's sort of where we are right now in the anti-jihadi war, in that ultimately smart people are going to start to realize, okay, military is not in question, not a possibility. Now we need to start the information war. Who are our allies to do that? We don't necessarily have that many assets on the ground, so we have to use the assets we have. Let's start to use folks that share our liberal values, freedom, anti-theocrats, anti-communist, pro-free market, pro-liberty, and begin to create networks globally like we did in the Cold War. And that's, I think, what's going to happen with foreign policy. Some of it will be augmented by the religious freedom movements. Some of it will be augmented by free press movements. All of these things are going to start to, I think, build, and I'm working with a coalition of Muslims, ex-Muslims, atheists, all those who believe in and support America and our freedoms and Western freedoms, that realize that one of the biggest threats to global security is political Islam. So that's sort of where foreign policy is headed. I think in the meantime, what could derail some of that is if somehow all of a sudden, just like that happened. Remember, we got into the Vietnam War after the Cold War, during the Cold War, by Democrats, not by Republicans. And the reason Democrats took us into Vietnam was because they had so poorly fought the information war that it sucked us into significant military conflicts. So I think similarly right now, Democrats could suck us into some massive conflicts because they've been so incompetent at the appropriate judicious deployment of American troops and now withdrawal of American troops, that we might end up, if there is a hostage crisis or if there is other things that Americans just won't sit for, you might even end up having where the so-called progressivists of the Biden administration that so far have been running this pro-Islamist shop of our foreign policy might actually end up getting us into a massive conflict that could have been avoided. Yeah.
Well, the one that comes to mind is China and Taiwan.
Yeah.
This is I can't imagine that they have not at least looked at or talked about seizing this opportunity, this moment to basically pull back Taiwan into the mainland government, under the mainland control. So it's unfortunate. All right. Well, as always, I appreciate, very informative, very insightful, Dr. Jasser, and we'll have you back on time. Hopefully we don't have another conflict that we got to talk about, but I'm sure there will be. There's no shortage of this, and so it's very, very informative. Glad to have you back on again. So thank you.
Anytime.
All right.
It's always a joy. Thanks, Oris.
All right. This is Oris, the official old guy at oldguytalkstome.com. Remember, it's all about helping older guys create kick-ass lives for themselves and those that they love. And I want you to do several things. First of all, I want you to review, rate, and subscribe. And if you want to give me a bad review, that's fine too, because I love my trolls. I like to interact with my trolls. This is so much fun. You keyboard warriors. So until next time.
Thank you for joining Dr. Orist and his incredible guest. Like what you heard and learned? Then be sure to do 3 things. 1, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. 2, share this with someone who may need to hear it. 3, leave a review and rate this podcast. Opt in at www.thestandard.academy/magazine and get our free digital magazine with savings, articles, and deeper dives into cool controversy. Be the guy who takes action. Without action, you're not going to get the results you want. Thank you again, and make it a great day.